Clara Whitfield's tears hit the wedding contract before the ink even dried, and every soul packed into that little Wyoming chapel turned to stare at a bride who was sobbing instead of smiling. Nathan Cole didn't reach for her hand and tell her to hush. He didn't pretend not to notice. He got down on one knee right there in front of the whole judging town, took her trembling hands in his, and asked her 4 words nobody in that room expected to hear. "Tell me their names." What Clara said next would unravel a secret neither of them saw coming. If you're new here, welcome. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss where this story goes. And do me a favor, drop a comment down below and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to where it all began on a platform in Red Creek, Wyoming, on the worst day of Clara Whitfield's life. The train pulled away from Red Creek Station in a groan of iron and steam, and Clara Whitfield stood there on the platform holding a suitcase that contained everything she owned in the world. A spare dress, her mother's sewing needle, a letter folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. She read that letter one more time, though she'd memorized every word of it somewhere around Nebraska. Miss Whitfield, I am the man of means and good standing in Red Creek, Wyoming, and I am in need of a wife to run my household. I will meet you at the station. Silas Duncan. No one met her. Clara stood in the thin morning light for the better part of an hour, watching the station empty out around her. A farmer collected his crates. A young mother scooped up a squalling boy and hurried off toward town. The station master swept his platform and refused to meet her eyes, which told Clara something before he ever opened his mouth. "Ma'am," he finally said, not unkindly, "you waitin' on someone." "Silas Duncan," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He was to meet me here." The station master's broom stopped moving. That was the first sign. "You're the mail-order bride," he said. Not a question. "I prefer correspondent," Clara said, and immediately regretted the bite in it. She was tired and frightened, and 3,000 miles from anywhere she'd ever called home. And this man hadn't done anything to deserve her sharpness. But he didn't take offense. He just looked at her the way you'd look at someone standing in the road ahead of a wagon they couldn't see coming. "Ma'am, I don't rightly know how to say this kindly, so I'll just say it. Silas Duncan sent word into town 2 days back. Said he'd changed his mind about the arrangement." Clara heard the words. She understood every one of them individually. But strung together, they refused to make sense the way a sentence stops meaning anything if you stare at it too long. "Changed his mind," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "About the wife he ordered." The station master winced at that like she'd said something crueler than he intended. "I'm sorry, truly. That ain't no way to treat a lady comin' all this way." Clara looked down at the letter in her hand. Read the word means. Read the word standing. Read the promise of a man she had crossed a continent to marry a man who did not think her worth the courtesy of showing up to say it to her face. "Is there somewhere I might send a telegram?" she asked, "to confirm this?" "Telegram office is closed till Monday, ma'am. And today is Saturday. 2 days." She would have to survive 2 days in a town where she knew no one, with no husband, no lodging arranged, and $19 sewn into the lining of her coat that were meant to last until Silas Duncan's household allowance began. She had lost her mother to fever, her father 6 months after that, to a grief that looked exactly like giving up, and her younger sister Emily to the same fever that took her mother all inside 18 months in Missouri. She had answered Silas Duncan's advertisement in a moment when she had nothing left to lose, and a paper full of promises seemed like more than the empty rooms she was sitting in. She had told herself somewhere around the Mississippi that she was done being surprised by how much worse things could get. She had been wrong. "Ma'am?" The station master shifted his weight. "You got somewhere to stay." "Not yet," Clara said, and hated how small her voice sounded saying it. Word travels faster in a small town than any train. And by the time Clara made her way from the platform into Red Creek proper, it was clear the whole town already knew her business. A cluster of women outside the mercantile stopped talking the moment she passed, which was its own kind of talking. A man leaning against the livery spat into the dirt and didn't bother lowering his voice. "That's her, the one Duncan sent back. Didn't even bother coming to look at her himself. Just sent word. Can't say I blame him none. What kind of woman answers an advertisement to marry a stranger?" Clara kept her chin up and her eyes forward, the way her mother had taught her to walk through any room that didn't want her in it. But her hands were shaking on the handle of her suitcase, and her face burned hot enough that she was certain everyone could see it. She had known there would be talk. She hadn't known it would feel like this, like being skinned in public one whisper at a time. "Miss Whitfield." The voice came from behind her, low and unhurried, and Clara turned to find a man in his shirt sleeves and a battered hat crossing the road toward her. He was tall in the way that made a person stand straighter, just to keep from feeling small next to him, with a weathered, sun-worn face that put him somewhere past 30, and eyes that watched the whole street around them, instead of just her, like a man who'd learned the hard way to notice trouble before it noticed him. "I don't believe we've met, sir," Clara said carefully. "No, ma'am, we haven't." He stopped a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat. "Name's Nathan Cole. I run a spread about 6 miles east of town. I was in the mercantile when word came through about Duncan." Clara's spine went rigid. "Then I imagine you've heard quite enough about my situation already. I heard a man made a promise and didn't keep it," Nathan said. "Didn't hear nothing that reflects poorly on you, ma'am, no matter what some folks around here seem to think." Something in his flat, plain delivery caught her off guard, more than sympathy would have. She'd braced herself for pity. She hadn't braced herself for someone simply stating a fact like it was obvious. "That's kind of you to say," Clara said, "though I suspect the whole town disagrees." "The whole town's got a lot of opinions and not much sense," Nathan said. "Wouldn't put too much stock in either." Before Clara could answer, a new voice cut across the street, sharper, oilier, the kind of voice that had learned to sound friendly while saying unfriendly things. "Well now, if it isn't Duncan's leftover bride." Clara turned to find a heavy-set man in a fine gray coat, approaching his boots, polished despite the dust of the street, a gold watch chain glinting at his vest. 2 other men trailed him, the kind who existed mainly to laugh when he wanted laughing at. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Clara said. "Wendell Pratt," the man said, sweeping off his hat with a flourish that felt more mocking than courteous. "I handle a good deal of business round these parts. Land mostly. Same business as your intended matter of fact. Shame about Duncan changing his mind. Man's got a habit of that." "Is that so?" Clara kept her voice even, though something in the way he said it, a habit of that, snagged at her attention. "Oh, sure." Pratt's smile widened, showing teeth. "Silas Duncan's ordered himself 3 brides in as many years, far as I know. Never quite settles on one. Costly habit, but a rich man can afford his habits." He looked her up and down in a way that made Clara's skin crawl slow and assessing like she was livestock at auction. "Though I'll say this, he might have done better to actually look at the merchandise 'fore he sent for it. You're a sight prettier than the last one." The men behind him laughed. Clara felt heat rush up her neck, humiliation and fury tangled together so tight she couldn't tell which was winning. "I am not merchandise, Mr. Pratt." No, course not," Pratt said, not sounding sorry in the slightest. "Just making conversation, ma'am. A woman alone in a strange town ought to have someone looking out for her interests. I'd be happy to discuss arrangements. I've got a house in town, plenty of room, and I ain't nearly so particular as Duncan." The insinuation sat there in the air, ugly and plain, and Clara's stomach turned over. "I'll manage my own arrangements." "Thank you," she said, and hated that her voice shook on the last word. "Suit yourself." Pratt shrugged, already turning to go, then paused and looked past her at Nathan, and something shifted in his face. Not fear exactly, but a wariness he hadn't shown Clara at all. "Cole, didn't see you standing there." "Reckon you didn't," Nathan said. He hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice. But something about the stillness of him had changed, gone taut as a drawn rope. "No offense meant," Pratt said, backing it up with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Wasn't taking any," Nathan said. Long as you're done. Pratt's smile flickered just slightly, and Clara understood in that moment that whatever history existed between these two men, it was old, and it was not friendly. Pratt tipped his hat again, shallow and quick, and moved off down the street with his two men trailing behind, and Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You all right, ma'am?" Nathan asked. "I've had better afternoons," Clara admitted. "Pratt's got a mouth on him and no shame to go with it. Wouldn't put much stock in anything he says either." Nathan glanced down the street where the man had gone something hard and unreadable in his expression before he turned back to her. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" "I was hoping to inquire at the boarding house. Mrs. Hensley runs it. She's a fair woman, but I'll tell you plain, ma'am, some of the talk that's already gone round town might reach her 'fore you do. Might make things harder than they need to be." Clara's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting I have no other option?" "No, ma'am. I'm suggesting you've got one more than you think." He said it simply without drama, the way a man might mention the weather, and Clara stared at him trying to work out what exactly he was offering and whether she dared trust it. "I don't follow, Mr. Cole. I've got a ranch that needs a woman's hand in the house. Been running it alone 2 years now, and it shows. I can pay a fair wage, proper wage, ma'am, not charity, and not anything more than that, unless you want it to be. Room and board included. You'd have your own space, your own lock on your own door, and nobody in town bothering you about it on account of you'd be working for me, not marrying me." Clara studied his face for any sign of the smirk Pratt had worn, any hint of the same ugly calculation. She found none. Just a plain, tired steadiness, a man laying out an offer the way he might describe fence posts that needed mending. "Why would you do this for a stranger, Mr. Cole?" Something moved behind his eyes, brief and gone before she could name it. "Because I watched this whole town line up to kick a woman when she was already down, and I didn't much care for the sight of it," he said. "That's reason enough for me. And if I refuse, then I'll tip my hat and wish you well, and you won't see me again unless you want to." He met her eyes steady. "Ain't no obligation in it, ma'am. Just an offer." Clara looked past him down the street where Pratt's gray coat had already vanished around a corner, and thought of his slow, assessing eyes, and the word he'd used, arrangements, and what exactly he'd meant by it. She thought of Mrs. Hensley's boarding house, and the whispers that would already be waiting there. She thought of $19 sewn into a coat lining and a train ticket that had cost nearly everything else she had. She had come 3,000 miles on the strength of one stranger's letter and been abandoned for her trouble. She did not know why she should trust the word of a second stranger any more than the first. And yet, there was something in the flatness of Nathan Cole's offer that struck her as more honest than anything Silas Duncan had ever written her. He wasn't promising her a new life. He wasn't promising her anything at all beyond a wage and a locked door, which was strangely the most trustworthy thing anyone had said to her all day. "I'll want that in writing, Mr. Cole," Clara said. "Terms of employment, wages, duties, and the understanding that it is exactly what you say it is and nothing more." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth there and gone. "Yes, ma'am, that's fair. And I keep my own room with my own lock, as you said. Wouldn't have it any other way. And if I find the arrangement unsuitable, I may leave at any time, and you'll see me safely back to town. You have my word." Clara studied him a moment longer. Somewhere behind her, she could still feel the eyes of the town on her back, still hear the echo of Pratt's laughter and the whispers outside the mercantile. She thought of the letter in her coat pocket, the promise Silas Duncan had broken without a second thought, and wondered if she was simply exchanging one kind of foolishness for another. But Nathan Cole had not once looked at her the way Pratt had not once made her feel like something to be assessed and priced. He'd simply stood there steady as a fence post and offered her the one thing nobody else in Red Creek had bothered to offer: somewhere to stand. "All right, Mr. Cole," Clara said. "I accept." "Wagon's just past the livery," Nathan said, and reached for her suitcase before she could protest. "I'll get you settled 'fore dark." They walked together down the main street of Red Creek, and Clara felt the stares following them the whole way, some curious, some scornful, a few outright hostile, as though her simply surviving her humiliation was its own kind of offense. She kept her chin level and her eyes ahead the way her mother had taught her, and did not let a single one of them see how badly her hands were shaking. The wagon ride out of town was quiet. Nathan didn't press her with questions, and Clara found she was grateful for it, grateful for a silence that didn't demand anything of her. The town gave way to open country fields of pale grass rolling toward mountains that stood blue and distant against the sky. And somewhere in that long quiet, Clara allowed herself finally to breathe. "You're not what I expected," she said eventually, because the silence had gone on long enough that she felt she ought to fill some of it. "Meanin' what, ma'am?" "Meaning I expected either pity or advantage. You've offered neither." Nathan kept his eyes on the road ahead, hands loose on the reins. "Pity don't fix anything. And I've got no use for advantage I didn't earn. That's a rare philosophy in a place like this from what little I've seen of it today." "Red Creek's got its share of decent folks," Nathan said. "Just happened you met the other kind first." Clara considered that, and considered him the set of his jaw, the careful, deliberate way he held himself like a man accustomed to being alone with his own thoughts, and none too eager to share them. "May I ask you something, Mr. Cole?" "You can ask." "That man in town, Pratt, there's history between you." Nathan's hands tightened just slightly on the reins. "There is. Will you tell me?" "Not today," Nathan said, and there was nothing unkind in it, just a door closing gently rather than slammed. "Today you've had enough thrown at you without me addin' to the pile." Clara accepted that, though it did nothing to quiet the questions gathering in the back of her mind. A man like Pratt didn't go wary and careful around just anyone. Whatever lay between him and Nathan Cole, it ran deep enough that even the mention of it changed the air. The ranch house came into view as the sun began to lean west. A modest structure of weathered timber. A barn beyond it, fences stretching out toward the tree line. It was tidy. Clara could see that much even from a distance, the fences mended, the yard swept clear, but there was something unmistakably bare about it too, something missing that she couldn't quite name yet. Nathan helped her down from the wagon and carried her suitcase to the porch, and Clara followed him inside to find a house that was clean but strangely hollow. No pictures on the walls. No cloth on the table beyond what function required. A house kept in good order by a man who had stopped expecting anyone to see the inside of it. "Your room's down the hall, first door," Nathan said. "Lock's on the inside like I promised. Kitchen's through there if you're hungry. I'll see to the horses and leave you be." "Thank you, Mr. Cole." He paused at the door, hat in hand, and looked back at her, not with pity, not with the calculation she'd seen in Pratt's eyes, but with something quieter that she didn't have a name for yet. "Ma'am, for what it's worth. Whatever Duncan told you, whatever this town's whispered today, none of it says a thing true about you. Says plenty about them." He was gone before she could find an answer for that, out into the yard, and the fading light, and Clara stood alone in the hollow, tidy kitchen of a stranger's house, 3,000 miles from anywhere she'd ever called home, and let herself cry for the first time since the train pulled away from that empty platform. She cried for her mother, and her father, and her sister Emily, for the family she'd buried one after another, until there was no one left to bury her. She cried for the humiliation of standing on that platform, waiting for a man who never intended to come. She cried, though she didn't fully understand why, for the strange guarded kindness of Nathan Cole, a man who'd offered her shelter and asked for nothing in return, except honesty about what it was. She did not yet know about the wife he'd buried 2 years before, or the reasons Wendell Pratt went careful and wary in his presence, or that Silas Duncan's broken promise was not the accident of a fickle man, but a single thread in something far larger and far more dangerous than a canceled wedding. She only knew that for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she had a locked door of her own and a bed that was hers for as long as she chose to stay, and that outside in the deepening dark, a quiet man was tending to horses and giving her exactly the kind of privacy that let her fall apart without an audience. It was not the life she had crossed a continent expecting to find. It was for now enough. Clara was up before the sun. She hadn't planned on it. She hadn't planned on sleeping at all, if she was honest, not in a stranger's house 3,000 miles from anything familiar. But somewhere in the dark hours, she'd cried herself empty and then simply stopped the way a storm stops, not gradually, but all at once, leaving a hollow quiet behind. She lay in the narrow bed in the room Nathan Cole had given her, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of a house settling around her, and at some point, without meaning to, she slept. She woke to the sound of boots on the porch boards. Not creeping, not stealthy, just the ordinary sound of a man moving about before daylight, because that was what men like Nathan Cole did. Clara lay still a moment listening and realized she wasn't afraid. That surprised her more than the sound itself had. She got up dressed in the half-dark and found the kitchen by memory. The stove was already warm. Nathan had built the fire up before going out, and there was water in the kettle, already beginning to knock, and a small sack of coffee grounds on the counter that someone she suspected Nathan had set out the night before, where she'd be sure to find it. Clara stood there looking at that coffee sack for a moment longer than made sense, because there was something in that small, silent gesture that undid her a little. Not pity, not charity. Just here is what you'll need, and I thought of it before you had to ask. She made coffee. She found eggs and flour and the beginnings of bacon and had breakfast on the table by the time she heard Nathan's boots on the porch steps. He came through the door and stopped dead when he saw the table. "You didn't have to do that, ma'am," he said. "You set out the coffee," Clara said. He looked at the coffee pot, then at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite discomfort, not quite warmth, something in between. "That's different." "It isn't really," Clara said. "Sit down, Mr. Cole. Food's hot." He sat. He ate without ceremony, the way a man eats who's used to doing it alone and doesn't think much about it. But he said thank you at the end, and he said it like he meant it, and that was enough. "I'd like to know what's expected of me," Clara said when the silence had stretched to a comfortable length. "If I'm to earn my wage, I should know the work. House needs managing. That's the start of it." Nathan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and seemed to be choosing his words the way a man picks footing across uncertain ground. "I've been coming in from the fields and cooking whatever's easiest and not doing much beyond that. The place has gotten sparse." Sparse was a generous word for it, Clara thought, but she kept that to herself. "I can manage the house. Cooking, cleaning, mending. What else? There's accounts I haven't gotten to in a while. Ledger work, supply lists. I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm better with horses than numbers, truth told." "I can do that too," Clara said. "I kept my father's books from the time I was 14. He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between surprise and a kind of careful reassessment, like a man revising a calculation he'd thought was already finished. "All right then," he said finally. "We'll work it out as we go." "We will," Clara agreed. That was how it started. Not with declarations or elaborate arrangements, but with coffee set out before dawn and a breakfast eaten in a kitchen that had been cold and empty for too long, and two people who had both lost too much to waste energy on anything that wasn't plain and honest. Clara spent the first 3 days simply learning the shape of the place, what was broken and what only needed attention, what had been let go, and what Nathan had kept up with a stubborn, quiet diligence that told her something about him without his ever saying a word. The barn was immaculate, every stall clean, every piece of tack hung and oiled, every feed bin properly covered. The horses were well fed and calm, and clearly handled with care. But the house had been survived, not lived in. Curtains hung crooked. The table had a split in it that had been left to widen. 2 of the kitchen chairs rocked on uneven legs. Nothing was dirty exactly, but nothing felt like it belonged to anyone either. On the 4th morning, Clara took the curtains down and washed them. She was out back hanging them to dry when she heard the sound of hoofbeats coming into the yard fast, and Nathan's voice, sharp in a way she hadn't heard from him yet, edged with something that wasn't quite alarm, but was close to it. "Bill." "What is it?" Clara turned to find a young ranch hand, barely 20, swinging down from a horse that was breathing hard from a run. His name was Billy Marsh. She'd learned Nathan's only full-time hand, a lanky, good-natured boy who'd greeted her first arrival with polite curiosity, and none of the town's judgment. "Pratt's man was at the fence line again, Mr. Cole," Billy said, pulling his hat off and running a hand through his sweat-damp hair. "South corner. Didn't come onto the property, but he was measuring. Had a pole and a string, and one of them transit things the surveyors use." Nathan went very still. Clara had learned already that Nathan's stillness was not the same as other men's stillness. Other men went still because they'd run out of things to say. Nathan went still because he was thinking several things at once and choosing precisely which one to speak out loud. "Which man?" "The one with the red beard. Harkin, I think." "How long was he there?" "Near an hour before I spotted him. Took off when he saw me coming." Nathan's jaw moved once. "All right. Keep it to yourself for now, Bill. Don't mention it in town." "Yes, sir." Billy hesitated. "Mr. Cole, this the third time in 2 months." "I know. What do you reckon he's after?" "I reckon," Nathan said, "that what Pratt's after is none of Pratt's business. Go get Comet watered." Billy went. Nathan stood in the yard for a moment, and Clara watched him from across the yard, watched him bring whatever was raging behind those steady eyes back under a control so practiced it looked like calm. Then he turned and found her watching, and something in his expression flickered. "Sorry about the disruption, ma'am." "Don't apologize," Clara said. "Is your land in trouble?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Not today. But possibly." "Possibly?" he admitted, and that single word cost him something. She could tell some portion of the composure he'd spent years building into something impenetrable. "Pratt's been trying to get his hands on the east portion of my spread for near 4 years. Claims the original deed has an error in the boundary survey. It doesn't, but that ain't stopped him from making the argument." "Has he taken it to a judge?" "Twice." The word was clipped and flat. "Both times the claim was dismissed, but dismissed don't mean he's done. A man like Pratt don't quit because he lost. He quits when there's no more angle left to work." "And he's looking for a new angle," Clara said. Nathan looked at her, and this time the reassessment in his expression was less careful and more direct. "You follow quick, ma'am." "My father had a neighbor dispute over water rights for 7 years, Clara said. "I watched him fight it from both sides. I know what it looks like when a man's wearing you down on purpose." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then, "What happened your father's dispute?" "He won," Clara said. "But it took everything he had to do it. The neighbor figured if he kept my father busy defending what he had, my father wouldn't have time or money to expand. He was right about that part." She paused. "He just didn't account for my father being more stubborn than he was." A brief, rare thing crossed Nathan Cole's face. Then something that in a different man, on a different day, might have been the beginning of a smile. It was there and gone so fast, she almost doubted she'd seen it. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. He went to check on Billy and Comet, and Clara went back to her curtains, and neither of them said anything more about Pratt that day. But that night after supper, Clara found the ledger. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been reorganizing the kitchen shelves, trying to impose some order on what appeared to have been a system based entirely on the principle of wherever it lands is where it lives. When she'd pulled down a wooden box to move it and found the ledger underneath, or rather, found 3 ledgers in a state that could most charitably be described as a work in progress and less charitably as a disaster, she sat down at the table with them before she'd even made a conscious decision to do so. 2 years of accounts, she discovered, and the first year was kept in a tight, careful hand. She didn't recognize neat columns and precise notations, everything accounted for down to the last cent. She knew instinctively who had kept that ledger. The same person whose absence had left this house feeling like a room with all the furniture moved out. The second year was Nathan's. She knew that too before she'd compared a single entry because it looked exactly like a man who was competent at everything except the one thing he was trying to do. The numbers were right. She checked them twice because she couldn't help herself. The arithmetic was solid. But the organization was a trail of someone who'd kept going because he had to, rather than because he knew where he was going. There were 3 creditors she didn't recognize listed in the second-year accounts, with entries that started small and grew steadily larger, and she stayed up past midnight working through the math before she understood what she was seeing. She was still at the table when Nathan came through at midnight for water, and he stopped short at the sight of her, the 3 ledgers spread open and covered in her own notations in the margins. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Finishing what you started," Clara said without looking up. "You've got a problem." "I know I've got a problem. I've had—" He stopped, crossed the kitchen and looked over her shoulder at the open page, and she could feel the moment he saw what she'd circled the quiet breath he drew in and didn't quite let out normally. "How'd you find—" "I wasn't looking," Clara said, and looked up at him then. "I want to be clear about that, but I found it, and I've spent the last 3 hours working through it, and you need to know what I know." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and she turned the ledger so he could see it clearly and showed him. "These 3 accounts," she said, pointing. "Harmon's Feed, the Territorial Supply Company, and this one, Gallatin Loans. Look at the rate of increase." Nathan looked. "I know about the feed and supply. That's just the ranch debt accumulating since—" He stopped again. "Since I had less help." "The ranch debt isn't the problem," Clara said. "Not yet. It's heavy, but it's manageable if this year's cattle sale comes through the way your notes suggest it should." She moved her finger to the 3rd column. "This one is the problem. Gallatin Loans. Do you know who holds your note with them? A land bank out of Cheyenne. Who sold that note originally?" Nathan's face went very still. "What do you mean sold it?" "The notations change in the 3rd quarter of last year. The interest rate jumps, and there's a name added here in what looks like different handwriting. W.P. initialed in pencil. Do you see it?" He leaned forward, and she watched the color leave his face. "Pratt," he said, very quietly. "Wendell Pratt." "W.P.," Nathan said, and his voice had gone flat in a way that raised every hair on Clara's arms. "The son of a—" He caught himself. "Excuse me, ma'am." "Don't excuse yourself on my account," Clara said. "Tell me what this means." "It means Pratt bought my debt." Nathan pushed back from the table and stood up, not from agitation so much as the need for space, the way a man moves when something big is landing on him and he needs his feet under him to bear the weight. "He bought my debt from the Cheyenne Bank, and he's been holding the note, and I didn't know. I have been paying Wendell Pratt for the past 8 months without knowing it." "And if you can't pay—" "If I can't pay," Nathan said, "he can call the note. And if he calls the note, he can move against the collateral." His jaw set hard. "The land." The room was very quiet for a moment. "He didn't need to win in court," Clara said slowly, because she was working it through as she said it. "He's been setting this up from the other direction. If he owns your debt, he doesn't need a judge to find in his favor. He just needs you to miss a payment." Nathan turned and looked at her from across the kitchen, and she could see what it cost him having a woman he'd known less than a week sitting at his table telling him something about his own situation that he'd missed. Not because he thought less of her for having found it, she could tell that much, but because the finding of it meant he'd had a blind spot, and Nathan Cole was not a man who allowed himself blind spots. "When's the payment due?" Clara asked. 1st of November. "How far out does—" 6 weeks. She ran the numbers in her head, the ones she'd been running for the last hour. "The cattle sale when? 3rd week of October, if the buyer comes through. And if he comes through at the price your notes project, then I'm inside the margin. Barely, but inside it. And if he doesn't—" Nathan sat back down. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, and she saw something she hadn't seen in him before. Not defeat, nothing that close to it, but the edge of it. The place where a man who'd been holding everything together starts to feel the weight. "Then I've got a problem," he said. "Then we've got a problem." Clara corrected him, and was surprised to find she meant it. He looked at her. "Ma'am, this isn't your fight. You gave me a wage and a roof and didn't once look at me the way every other person in this town did today," Clara said. "As far as I'm concerned, that earns some loyalty. I've got a head for numbers, and apparently you need one. So, let's think." Something moved behind his eyes that she wasn't sure he intended her to see. "All right," Nathan said after a moment. "Let's think." They were up until 2 in the morning. Clara reorganized the accounts and Nathan provided the knowledge she lacked, who was reliable, who could be approached, what the cattle market had looked like the past 3 years, and what it was likely to do. She asked questions, and he answered them, and somewhere in the 3rd hour, they stopped being a woman of uncertain standing and a man of uncertain motive, and became something simpler and more useful. 2 people solving the same problem. By the time they closed the last ledger, they had a plan. Not a comfortable one, not one that didn't depend on things going right that could equally go wrong. But a plan, and that was more than Nathan Cole had had when he sat down. "You should sleep," he said, because it was past 2, and she was rubbing her eyes without seeming to notice she was doing it. "So should you." "I don't sleep much." Clara looked at him across the table, at the tired lines around his eyes and the set of his mouth. "How long has it been like that?" He knew what she was asking. She could tell he knew, and she expected him to close the door the way he'd closed it that afternoon in the yard, gently but firmly. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the closed ledger between them on the table. 2 years, he said, give or take. Since your wife died. It wasn't a question. She'd worked that much out from the ledger entries, from the change in the handwriting, from the way the house had been lived in, until it suddenly hadn't. He looked up at her, and she expected some form of defensiveness, but instead found something she hadn't anticipated: relief. The barely there, still startled relief of a man who's been carrying something too heavy alone for too long, and has just had someone acknowledge the weight. "Rebecca," he said. Her name, just that, and something in the way he said it told Clara everything she needed to know about what those 2 years had been like for Nathan Cole. "I'm sorry," Clara said. And she meant it the way she knew how to mean it, the way someone means it when they've also stood beside too many graves. "She was the one kept the books," Nathan said after a moment. "She was the one kept a lot of things." He looked down at the ledger. "I just didn't think to look at the accounts the same way she did. Should have looked closer." "You were managing," Clara said. "That's not a failure, Mr. Cole. That's just what it is when everything lands on one set of hands." He looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the kitchen was quiet around them, except for the small sounds of the house settling in the cold. And Clara felt with sudden, unexpected certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because of fate or providence or any of the stories people told themselves, but because 2 people who had each lost too much had found a way by some accident of circumstance to be useful to each other. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't the life she'd crossed a continent imagining. It was, she thought, something more honest than that. She went to bed at 2:30 and slept without dreaming for the first time since Missouri. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that neither of them had planned, but both seemed to fall into naturally. Clara ran the house and the accounts. Nathan ran the ranch and the fields. Billy Marsh split himself between them, fetching and carrying and reporting on the fence lines, with the diligence of a boy who understood more about what was happening on that land than anyone would have guessed from looking at him. The house changed in those weeks. Clara did it carefully, without asking, because she understood instinctively that a man like Nathan Cole would stop her if she asked, and not because he didn't want the change, but because he wouldn't know how to say yes to it without saying something else at the same time. So she did it quietly, one thing at a time. She straightened the curtains she'd washed and rehung them. She mended the split in the kitchen table with a paste she made from sawdust and glue. She bought fabric from the mercantile on her first trip to town for supplies. Plain cotton. Nothing extravagant, and stitched a cloth for the table and set it out one morning without comment. Nathan sat down to breakfast, looked at the cloth on the table and said nothing. But he ran his thumb along the edge of it before he picked up his coffee cup, just once, a gesture so brief and unthinking she almost missed it. She didn't miss it. The town remained complicated. Clara went to Red Creek for supplies twice in those first weeks, and each time felt the divided nature of its opinion pressing on her from both sides. There were those who had decided she was either too bold or too shameless a woman, living on a single man's ranch, who wasn't his wife, and wasn't, as far as they could see, showing sufficient mortification about it. And there were those few who, for their own reasons, had decided she was to be respected. Mrs. Eliza Tanner, at the dry goods store, who'd greeted her first with cool reserve, and then upon learning she kept Nathan Cole's books, had upgraded immediately to something approaching warmth. "He needs the help," Mrs. Tanner had said, packing Clara's order briskly and without ceremony. "That man's been fighting on 3 fronts since Rebecca passed, and none of us could do a thing to make him slow down long enough to see what was piling up behind him." "He's not slow to see things," Clara said carefully. "No, he ain't. That's not the problem." Mrs. Tanner had glanced up at her sharp and direct. "The problem's he's been looking for threats in front of him so long he stopped checking what was working around the sides." She'd paused. "You found something, didn't you?" "In his accounts." Clara had met her eyes steadily. "I can't discuss Mr. Cole's business, ma'am." "No." Mrs. Tanner had agreed, and there'd been something like approval in her voice. "No, you can't, can you?" And she'd packed the rest of the order without another word about it. The harder encounter was the one Clara hadn't been able to avoid. It happened on her second trip to town, when she'd been loading supplies into Nathan's wagon outside the Mercantile and heard footsteps behind her that stopped just close enough to be deliberate. "Miss Whitfield." She turned to find Wendell Pratt without his usual men, for once standing with his hat in his hand, in an attitude of false courtesy that she'd already learned to read like a weather sign. The hat-in-hand routine was his version of a flag of truce. He used it right before he said something designed to rattle. "Mr. Pratt," Clara said, and kept loading. "I see Cole's got you running his errands now," Pratt said. "Must be handy having somebody in that house again." "I work for Mr. Cole," Clara said. "I don't imagine that's news to you." "No, it ain't." Pratt moved to the side of the wagon, not blocking her exactly, but making her aware that he was there. "Tell me something, Miss Whitfield. How much do you actually know about the man you're working for?" Clara set down the crate she was holding and turned and looked at him directly. She'd learned from the first day that Pratt did his best work when he was doing it to the back of someone's head or the side of their face when they couldn't fully see him. "I know enough," she said. "Do you know why his wife died?" The question was a blade thrown quick and flat, the way you throw something at a person's face to see what they'll do when there's no time to think. Clara looked at him without blinking. "I know she died. The circumstances are none of my business." "Interesting that he ain't told you," Pratt said. "Interesting that you think I'd take your word on it if he had," Clara said. Something sharpened in Pratt's eyes. She'd expected that a man who'd made his career in manipulation would not much appreciate having it named to his face. What she hadn't expected was what came next, because Pratt shifted his weight slightly, and his voice dropped, went quieter, and the performance fell away for just a moment. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he said. "When you first stepped off that train, I thought you were just another woman who'd made a bad bet." "I was," Clara said. "I made a better one after." Pratt almost smiled. It was the closest to a real expression she'd seen from him. "Cole is a man with a lot of pride and not much room to bend. Things are going to come difficult for him in the next couple of months. When they do—" He paused, deliberate. "Not saying if Miss Whitfield, when. There might be a better position available for a woman of your intelligence someplace a little more secure." "I appreciate the concern," Clara said in the tone that indicated she did not. "Now, if you'll excuse me." She got up on the wagon seat and drove out of town without looking back, and she did not say a word to Nathan about the conversation that night or the next day, because she needed time to think about what Pratt had said and why exactly he'd said it. When, not if. He knew something about Nathan's finances, she was sure of it. Either he'd gotten word through another channel about the accounts, or he was simply confident in his own setup. A man who owned Nathan's debt knew exactly what the payment schedule looked like. He'd done the math already. He knew what November would bring, which meant he wasn't warning her off. He was recruiting her. He thought she could be bought, or scared. He hadn't decided which yet. Clara sat with that for 3 days before she told Nathan. She told him on a Thursday evening after supper, while they were both still at the table with the cloth on it, that had become, without either of them quite deciding it, the place where they did their real talking. She told him everything Pratt had said word for word, the way her father had taught her to report a thing without commentary, without editorializing. Lay it flat on the table and let the person hearing it form their own response. Nathan listened without interrupting. That she'd learned was what he did. He listened completely and didn't speak until he had something worth saying. "He's testing you," Nathan said when she finished. "I know. He wants to know if you're a loose end in my house or a—" Nathan stopped. "Or a piece he can use." "I know that too," Clara said. "I told you because you need to know what he thinks he can do, and because—" She hesitated, then pushed through it. "Because he said something about how your wife died. I didn't ask him what he meant. I don't want you to think I'm asking you now. I'm not. But if there's something I should know that bears on what's happening with this land and his claim on your debt, then I'm asking you to tell me." The silence that followed was the longest she'd experienced with Nathan Cole, and she'd sat through some significant ones. He stood up, walked to the window, stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she let him have it. Let him have the time he needed, because she'd learned that much about him in 5 weeks, that he could be pushed to the wall and he'd fight you, but if you gave him room, he'd come to the truth on his own. "Rebecca didn't die natural," Nathan said. He said it quietly, without turning around. "There was a fever that went through, and she got it, and she didn't come back from it. That part's true." He paused. "But she got sick that winter, because we were out of money enough that I couldn't get the doctor from Cheyenne in time. And we were out of money because Pratt had gotten into my supply lines and pushed up the costs through every channel he had until I was bleeding out 6 different ways at once, and didn't see it." His voice was still quiet, still controlled. Like a man reciting something he'd rehearsed 1,000 times and still couldn't get through without the weight of it. "I didn't put it together until after she was gone. And by the time I understood what he'd done there, wasn't a judge in the territory who would have called it murder because it wasn't. Not the kind you can prove." Clara sat very still. "He knows I know," Nathan said. "That's why it's never been direct what he does. It's always around the edges. He can't touch me head on, so he works around." He finally turned, looked at her across the kitchen, and his face was a thing she wouldn't forget for the rest of her life. Not broken, not defeated, but worn to the core, the way stone is worn by water, slowly, relentlessly over years. "Now he's working around me through the debt, and he's trying to work around through you. He's underestimating both of us," Clara said. Nathan looked at her. "He thinks I'm a woman with no options, which means he thinks I can be bought or frightened," Clara said. "And he thinks you're a man who's too proud to ask for help, which means he thinks you'll refuse it until it's too late." She folded her hands on the table. "He's wrong on both counts. So let's make sure he stays wrong." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "You've been here 5 weeks, he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not quite disbelief, more like a man who's walked into a room he thought was empty and found something in it worth stopping for. "I'm aware," Clara said. "You don't have any obligation to—" "Nathan." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and she saw him register it, saw the small, involuntary steadying of a man who'd been addressed simply and directly as himself. "I kept the books for my father for 6 years, while he fought a neighbor over water rights. I watched him refuse every piece of help anyone offered because he thought needing help was the same thing as losing, and then I watched it cost him." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to watch that happen again." Nathan Cole stood across the kitchen from her and looked at her for a long moment, and Clara did not look away. "All right," he said finally, very quietly. "All right," Clara agreed. That was the night everything shifted between them, though neither of them would have named it that or given it any name at all. It wasn't a dramatic thing, nothing with declarations or confessions of feeling. It was simpler than that. It was the moment 2 people who'd been being careful with each other stopped being careful about the same thing. They were still careful, Nathan still came in from the fields and said ma'am, when he spoke to her still kept himself at the particular kind of polite considered distance that a man keeps when he is acutely aware of not overstepping. Clara still knocked before entering any room he was in first. The formalities remained and would remain for some time, but under the formalities, something had settled and taken root that hadn't been there before. A foundation that wasn't made of proximity or convenience or even gratitude, though it contained some of both. It was made of trust. Real trust, the kind that doesn't come from promises, but from watching what a person does when they have the option not to. Billy noticed the way young men notice things about other people's feelings, even when they're oblivious to their own. He didn't say anything about it for a week, and then one morning when Clara was checking the supply list and he was supposed to be fetching water, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and said with the particular careful nonchalance of someone who's rehearsed the casual, "You're good for him, you know, Mr. Cole." Clara looked up from the list. "I work for him, Billy." "Yes, ma'am," Billy said in a tone that acknowledged the statement while declining to accept it as the full picture. "Shouldn't you be getting water?" "Yes, ma'am," Billy said again, and went to get it. The October buyer came through on the 19th. His name was Reginald Cross, and he was a cattle broker from Denver who'd bought Nathan's stock 2 years running and greeted Nathan with the handshake of a man who'd made good money off their past transactions and intended to make more. Clara had the figures ready before he arrived, the numbers she'd spent 2 weeks refining the projections, the inventory Nathan had walked her through, head by head. She sat in on the negotiation at Nathan's request, introduced as his bookkeeper, and watched the buyer's eyebrows go up slightly and then down again, as he apparently decided it was none of his business. The price Cross offered was 60 cents on the dollar below what they needed. Clara said nothing. She waited because she'd told Nathan beforehand that the first offer would be low and not to respond to it. Nathan thanked Cross for his time and began gathering his papers. Cross raised his offer. Nathan thanked him again and stood up. Cross raised it once more, and this time it was inside the margin, barely as Nathan had said, but inside it. Nathan looked at Clara across the table. Clara gave the smallest nod she could manage without moving her head. "We've got a deal, Mr. Cross," Nathan said. They shook hands. Cross left. Nathan sat back down across from Clara at the ranch table, and they looked at each other. And Clara let out a breath she'd been holding for 3 weeks. And for one brief, unguarded moment, she laughed. Just a small exhale of it. Relief and surprise in equal measure. And Nathan looked at her laugh, the way a man looks at light coming through a window he'd forgotten was there. November 1st was 12 days away, and Wendell Pratt was about to discover that the debt he'd bought to use as a weapon had just been paid in full. The payment cleared on October 28th, 3 days early. Clara had insisted on it not out of nervousness, she told herself, but out of the simple pragmatic logic that a man like Pratt would find a way to complicate a payment made on the exact due date, and a payment made 3 days prior gave him no such window. Nathan had looked at her when she said it, looked at her the way he'd been looking at her more frequently in recent weeks, like a man recalculating a figure he thought he already understood, and then he'd ridden into Cheyenne himself and handed the bank the full amount in cash and made them write the receipt twice. He brought her one of the copies. She hadn't asked for it. He set it on the table beside the ledger without comment. Just that, just the paper with the stamped seal and the zero balance, and Clara picked it up and read every word of it, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for 3 weeks. "It's done," she said. "It's done." Nathan agreed. What neither of them said, because saying it would have made it too large and too present, was what came next. Because settling the debt was not the same as being free of Wendell Pratt. They both understood that. Pratt had lost one angle, the cleanest angle, the one that would have let him move against the land legally and quietly, the way he preferred to work. That didn't mean he was finished. It meant he was angry, and an angry Pratt, as Nathan could have told anyone who'd lived in the territory long enough, was a more dangerous thing than a patient one. They were right to worry. It started with the talk. Clara had grown accustomed to the divided nature of Red Creek's opinion, had learned which streets were easier and which shopkeepers would find something urgent to look at whenever she walked past. She'd built a working relationship with Mrs. Tanner at the dry goods store, and a careful, cordial neutrality with most of the rest. The whispers about her living arrangement had never fully died, but they'd settled into a kind of background noise she'd learned to walk through without flinching. The new talk was different. She first heard it on a Wednesday 5 days after the payment cleared, when she went in to settle the supply account at the mercantile. The two women at the counter stopped talking the moment she pushed through the door and started again just slightly too loudly after she'd passed, and the words she caught were not the usual shape of gossip. Been asking questions about the deed. Said there's a second survey one from '79. Nathan Cole's got no more right to that east parcel than woman. He brought in doesn't know what she got herself into. Clara paid for her supplies with a steady hand and a level face, and drove the 6 miles back to the ranch and told Nathan everything she'd heard before she'd even taken off her coat. He listened, standing in the middle of the kitchen, and when she finished, his expression told her what she'd suspected. This wasn't new exactly. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. There is a second survey, Nathan said. Clara went still. From 1879, he continued, before I bought the land. The original owner had the property surveyed twice because the first survey came back with an inconsistency on the east boundary. The second survey corrected it. The deed reflects the second survey. That's what's been recorded at the county office for 11 years. But Pratt has the first survey, Clara said. Pratt has a copy of the first survey, Nathan said. And he spent 2 years arguing that it's the legally binding one and the second was improperly filed. The judge disagreed. Twice. He paused. But a judge in a courtroom is one thing. A judge who's up for reappointment and has a man like Pratt applying pressure on the county commissioners is another thing entirely. He's going after the judge, Clara said. Or he already has, Nathan said. I don't know which. Clara pulled out a chair and sat down because her legs had suddenly made the executive decision to stop doing their job. She'd thought the debt was the worst of it. She'd thought paying it off meant they were through the worst. She'd been wrong in the way that a person is wrong when they've only seen part of the map they're standing on. Nathan, she said carefully, tell me everything, not the parts you've been protecting me from, everything. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down across from her and told her. Pratt's claim on the east parcel wasn't simply about the land itself, though the land was valuable enough. Good grazing a creek that ran year-round, the kind of terrain that made a neighboring spread significantly more profitable with it than without it. What Pratt wanted was access to the water. The creek that ran through Nathan's east parcel was the same creek that 6 miles south ran through a stretch of territory that Pratt was quietly assembling into what amounted to a water monopoly. If he could demonstrate control of the source, he could leverage every rancher and farmer downstream into paying for what the land had always given them free. Nathan was not the only obstacle, but he was the oldest one, and the one with the most legitimate claim, which meant he was the first one Pratt needed to remove. The debt had been the most elegant attempt. When it failed, the survey dispute was the fallback messier more public, but potentially more permanent, if Pratt could find a judge willing to reopen what 2 previous judges had closed. And he's found one, Clara said. It wasn't quite a question. I think he's working on it, Nathan said. Billy's been hearing things. One of the county commissioners has been seen at Pratt's house twice in the past week. We need the original deed documents, Clara said. The filed ones, the ones at the county office. I have copies. I want the originals. Or certified copies from the county clerk dated and stamped. Clara leaned forward. If Pratt's going to make a move through the courts, he needs a hearing. A hearing needs notice. And notice gives us time to put those documents in front of a different judge before Pratt gets to pick one. Nathan studied her. You know how courts work. My father spent 7 years in them, Clara said. I paid attention. The county clerk is named Davies, Nathan said slowly. He's been clerk for 14 years. He's honest, or as honest as a man stays when he's surrounded by people who aren't. But he's also cautious. He won't do anything he thinks might come back on him. Then we won't ask him to do anything, Clara said. We'll ask him to do his job, certify the documents he already has on file, that's all. There's nothing in that for Pratt to use against him. Unless Pratt's already gotten to him. Has he? Nathan was quiet for a moment. I don't know. Then we find out, Clara said. They went to the county office on Thursday morning together, which itself Clara knew would be a statement. Nathan Cole and the woman from his ranch walking into the county clerk's office side by side. She wore her better dress and her best posture, and kept her face pleasant and completely unrevealing of the anxiety running through her like cold water. Davies was a small, meticulous man of 50 who wore his spectacles pushed up on his forehead when he wasn't reading, which gave him a perpetual look of mild surprise. He received them with courtesy and a careful, watchful quality that told Clara the moment they walked in that he already knew why they were there. Nathan asked for certified copies of the deed and the second boundary survey, both on file. Davies said he would need to verify the filing status. Nathan said he understood, and they would wait. Davies went into the back. They waited for 22 minutes, Clara counted, which was approximately 18 minutes longer than it should have taken to pull 2 documents from a file that Nathan had personally ensured was in order. When Davies returned, his expression had changed in a way that was subtle enough to ignore and impossible to miss. Mr. Cole, Davies said, setting the documents on the counter with the careful precision of a man touching something he'd prefer not to touch. The deed is in order. I can certify it without any difficulty. And the survey, Nathan said. Davies adjusted his spectacles. The second survey, the 1879 filing, there appears to be a question about the original registration stamp, whether it was properly processed at the time of filing. Clara felt the ground shift under the conversation. The same stamp that's been on file for 11 years without question, Nathan said. His voice was still even, but she could hear the control it was taking. I understand it may seem that way, Davies said. He was not looking at Nathan. He was looking at the document in front of him with the fixed attention of a man who has been told to look at a document and is looking at it. But there's been an inquiry submitted to this office regarding the validity of that registration, and until the inquiry is resolved... Who submitted the inquiry? Clara said. Davies' eyes moved to her. He'd been addressing Nathan, the way men addressed men in county offices in 1884. Wyoming and her cutting in directly caught him enough off guard that he answered before he'd decided whether to. A legal representative on behalf of a private party, he said. Wendell Pratt, Nathan said. Davies said nothing, which was its own answer. Mr. Davies, Clara said, and she kept her voice the same careful level she'd have used discussing supply costs with Mrs. Tanner. I want to be sure I understand the situation. A document that has been on file in this office for 11 years, that has been examined and accepted as valid by 2 separate territorial judges, is now under an inquiry submitted by a private party who stands to benefit financially from its invalidation. And on the basis of that inquiry, no ruling, no court order, simply an inquiry, you are declining to certify it. Davies looked at her. I'm not declining, he said carefully. I'm indicating a delay. For how long? Until the inquiry is resolved. And who resolves it? Davies didn't answer. Mr. Davies, Clara said. I'm asking you who has the authority to resolve the inquiry, and I'm asking because if the answer is a judge, then I want the name of that judge, and I want it in writing from your office as the basis for the delay, because if this delay causes harm to Mr. Cole's land title, he'll need to know exactly which point in the process introduced it. The silence in the county office was the kind that has weight to it. Davies looked at Nathan. Nathan looked back at him without expression. I need to consult with the county attorney, Davies said. We'll be at the hotel, Nathan said. We'll wait. They were in the small parlor of the Red Creek Hotel for 2 hours. Clara drank bad coffee and did not allow herself to pace, though every part of her wanted to, and Nathan sat across from her in a chair and looked at the wall with the focused internal quality of a man doing complex mathematics in his head. He's already in it, Nathan said at the end of the first hour. Yes, Clara said. Pratt's gotten to him. Gotten to him or scared him, which amounts to the same thing. Clara turned her coffee cup in her hands. But he's not fully committed. If he were, he wouldn't have told us about the inquiry. he'd have simply said the documents were unavailable and shown us the door. He told us because he wanted us to know without having to own the reason, Nathan said. Wanted us to understand what we're up against without him having to be the one to say it. He paused. Man's conscience isn't entirely gone. Then there's something to work with, Clara said. At the 2-hour mark, a young clerk appeared in the parlor door and told them Mr. Davies would see them. When they returned to the office, Davies had the documents laid out on the counter. The deed, the second survey, both with a certification stamp and his signature at the bottom of each, the ink still wet. The inquiry was improperly filed, Davies said in a tone that indicated this was the version of events they would all be accepting and no further discussion was required. The documents are in order. Nathan took both documents and folded them with the careful precision of a man who understood exactly how much they were worth. Thank you, Mr. Davies, he said. Mr. Cole. Davies looked at him over his spectacles, and there was something in his expression that went beyond the transaction. I'd suggest you make additional copies. Store them outside the county. Nathan met his eyes. I'll do that. They were out on the street before Nathan said anything more. He's warning us, he said. He's warning us, Clara agreed. Which means he knows what Pratt's planning, and he wants it off his conscience without having to refuse the order when it comes. She stopped walking and turned to face him. Nathan. When Pratt finds out those documents are certified, he's going to move fast. We don't have time to wait and see what he does. What are you saying? Clara looked at him steadily. I'm saying we need to get ahead of it. Not react, get ahead. She took a breath. And I'm saying I think we need to talk about the other thing. Nathan waited. The talk in town, Clara said. About us. About the arrangement. She watched his face carefully because she needed to see how he received it before she said the next part. Pratt's people are using it. The fact that I'm in your house and we're not married, they're using it to undermine your credibility. A man of questionable moral arrangement, they'd say. A man whose household is irregular. She kept her eyes on his. It's not fair, and it's not honest, and none of it reflects the reality of what this is. But it's a lever, and Pratt knows how to use levers. Nathan was very still. You're not suggesting, he started. I'm asking you to consider it, Clara said. Not as a favor to me, not as charity, as a practical response to a practical threat. She kept her voice matter-of-fact because she needed him to hear the logic before the weight of what she was asking settled onto him. A married man with a wife who manages his books and understands his land situation is a different legal and social proposition than a bachelor with a female employee. It changes what Pratt can do to your reputation in front of a judge. It changes what the county commissioners think when they see you walk into a hearing. Clara. It was the first time he'd used her given name without the title, and she heard it register in her own chest in a way she hadn't prepared for. What you're describing is using a marriage the same way Pratt uses his money, as a tool. Yes, she said. It is. And you'd... He stopped, started again. You'd be willing to do that. She looked at him. This man who'd pulled a suitcase off a platform in a town that wanted no part of her, and offered her a locked door and a fair wage, and hadn't once looked at her like Pratt had, who'd sat up past midnight going through ledgers and told her about Rebecca in a voice that held the weight of 2 years of private grief, who'd said, "You don't have any obligation," in a tone that made it clear he'd release her without rancor the moment she asked. I'd be willing to marry you, Clara said. If you'd be willing to ask me. The silence between them was different from every other silence they'd shared. Nathan looked at her, really looked in a way that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't been in a long time, and something moved through his expression that she didn't try to name. This isn't the way I'd have... He stopped. I'd have wanted it to be different from this, he said quietly. You deserved better than coming 3,000 miles to be asked out of legal strategy. I came 3,000 miles to be abandoned on a platform, Clara said. This is considerably better than that. Something crossed his face, then pain and humor, and something more fragile than either all at once. Clara Whitfield, Nathan Cole said, and she could hear how carefully he was choosing each word. I am not able to promise you romance the way a younger man might. I am not able to promise you that I won't sometimes be difficult and too quiet and too stubborn for my own good." He looked at her steadily. "But I can promise you that I will not abandon you, not on a platform, not in a county office, not anywhere. And I can promise that whatever I have is yours to share equally, and whatever comes at this land comes at us both." He paused. "That's what I can offer." "Nathan?" Clara said, "That's everything." "Then will you marry me, ma'am?" "Yes," Clara said. "I will." They were married 6 days later, on a Saturday, in the Red Creek Church, with Reverend Mills officiating, and Mrs. Tanner as the only witness who'd been told in advance, though a handful of others filtered in, because word moves faster than intention in a small town. Billy Marsh stood near the back and tried very hard to look like he hadn't been hoping for this specific outcome since approximately his 3rd week of watching them work through ledgers at the kitchen table. Clara wore the best dress she'd brought from Missouri pressed the night before. Nathan wore his good shirt, the one she'd mended the collar on 2 weeks ago, because she'd noticed it was fraying, and he hadn't. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Mills was a practical man who understood that the occasion had practical underpinnings and did not require elaboration. He said the words that needed saying. Nathan said yes. Clara said yes. They signed the register, and it was done. The supper afterward was at the ranch, just the 4 of them. Nathan and Clara and Billy and Mrs. Tanner, who'd brought a cake she claimed was left over from another occasion, and nobody challenged her on it. They ate, and it was simple, and it was warm, and Clara had set the table with the cloth she'd made, and brought out the candle she'd been saving without letting herself think about what she was saving it for. And then Mrs. Tanner and Billy said their goodnights, and they were alone, and the ranch house was very quiet, and Clara sat at the table and looked at the candle burning, and found without warning that she was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears falling onto the tablecloth quiet as rain. She tried to stop it and couldn't, because the thing that was spilling out of her wasn't grief. Exactly. Wasn't happiness exactly. But something that had no clean name. The weight of the past year of Missouri, and the fevers and the graves, and the empty rooms, and the train, and the platform, and the humiliation, and the months of fighting to make something solid out of what had been wreckage. All of it all at once, finding the only exit available. Clara. She looked up. Nathan was standing across the table from her, not hovering, not panicked, simply present and attentive, in the way he'd been present and attentive since the first morning she'd put coffee on his table. "I'm sorry," she said, which was ridiculous, but she said it anyway. I don't know what this is." "You don't have to know," Nathan said. He sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her, which was different from anything he'd done before. "You've been carrying an awful lot for a long time." "I told myself I was done," Clara said. "On the train. I told myself I was done being surprised by how bad things could get, and then they kept getting worse, and You just kept going anyway," Nathan said. "It wasn't noble. It was just the only option." "That's what going forward usually is," Nathan said. "Doesn't make it easier." Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand, which was not elegant, but was the truth of the moment. "I keep thinking about my father walking me down the aisle. And my mother. And Emily." She stopped. "I kept thinking it today through the whole ceremony. That they should have been there. That my mother should have been fixing my dress, and my sister should have been laughing at something entirely inappropriate, and my father should have been—" She couldn't finish it. Nathan was quiet. She felt him beside her, the solidity of him not trying to stop the words or redirect them, just there. "Tell me their names," he said. Clara went still. She looked at him, and he was watching her with a steadiness that she understood all at once with complete clarity. He wasn't asking out of courtesy. He wasn't filling a silence. He was asking because he wanted to know, because he understood that the people she was crying for were not gone simply because she'd stopped talking about them, and because he was a man who had learned the hardest possible way what it cost to carry the dead alone. "My father," Clara said, "was William." "William," Nathan said, and the way he repeated it was like an acknowledgement, a witness to the name. "My mother was Margaret." She felt her throat tighten and pushed through it. She sang. All the time while she cooked, while she worked. She sang even when things were hard. Especially when things were hard. She paused. I haven't been able to remember the sound of it lately. That's what scares me. That I'll forget what she sounded like. You won't forget, Nathan said. He said it simply without sentiment, the way he said things he believed to be true. And my sister was Emily. Clara's voice broke on the name just slightly. She was 17. She had so much more. She stopped. Breathed. She would have liked you, I think. She liked quiet men. Said they were the ones worth trusting. Nathan was still for a long moment. Smart girl, he said. Clara laughed, and it came out wrong, came out broken and wet, and she covered her face with both hands, and Nathan put his arm around her carefully, with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, and she leaned into it, and let herself cry properly, finally, without apology, for all of them. They stayed like that for a while. The candle burned down. Outside, the night was still and cold and full of stars. And inside the ranch house, with the tablecloth and the repaired table and the curtains, she'd hung straight. Clara Whitfield. Clara Cole. Now, she supposed, cried herself empty for the last time, and felt something inside her, slowly begin to set the way, ground sets after a flood. After a while, Nathan said quietly, Rebecca. Clara went still under his arm. Her name was Rebecca Ann Cole, he said. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make it feel like it had always been waiting for her. She laughed too loud, and she kept the worst books I've ever seen, and she could outride most of the men in this county. His voice was steady and even, but it was the steadiness of a man walking a narrow bridge. And there isn't a morning I come into that kitchen that I don't expect to hear her singing. Clara lifted her head and looked at him. She would have liked you, Nathan said. She didn't have patience for people who weren't honest. You're honest even when it costs you something. Clara looked at him for a long moment. We're a pair, aren't we? She said softly. We are, Nathan agreed. He looked at her steadily. But I think we might be all right anyway, eventually. Clara considered that. Yes, she said. I think so too. The candle burned to its base and guttered out, and neither of them moved to light another, and the house sat quiet around them in the dark, and whatever had shifted between them that night settled into place like the last piece of something long in the building, and neither of them needed to name it to know it was there. They had been two strangers forced together by circumstance and survival, and the particular ruthlessness of Wendell Pratt. They were not strangers anymore, and Pratt, who had set all of this in motion, believing he was pulling apart a lonely man's last defenses, had instead made the single mistake that would cost him everything he'd spent 4 years building. He had given Nathan Cole a reason to stop standing alone. Pratt found out about the marriage on a Monday. Clara knew the exact moment it reached him, because Billy came back from town that afternoon moving faster than his usual unhurried lope, and the look on his face was the particular combination of alarmed and trying not to show it that she'd come to recognize in young men who'd witnessed something they didn't quite know how to report. He was at the saloon, Billy said, pulling his hat off as he came through the kitchen door. Pratt, I wasn't trying to hear anything, Mrs. Cole. I was picking up the harness from the leather shop next door, and the walls in that building ain't exactly... What did he say, Billy? Clara asked. Billy turned his hat in his hands. He said some things I won't repeat in front of you, ma'am. And then he said that Cole marrying a woman he'd known 6 weeks was either the act of a desperate man or a stupid one, and either way, it didn't change what was coming. What's coming? Clara said. Not a question. He said the survey hearing was already filed, said the judge had agreed to hear it, said... Billy stopped and looked at his hat, like the next words might be written on the brim, and he was hoping they weren't. Said that a piece of paper from the county clerk wasn't going to save a man whose deed had a flaw in it that 2 previous judges had simply failed to catch. Clara was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Billy, she said. Get yourself some water. You rode hard. She was at the table with the documents spread in front of her by the time Nathan came in from the south field, and she could tell from the set of his jaw that word had already reached him by some other route. The ranch hands talked. The territory talked. Sound traveled on flat land, the way it traveled on water. "You've heard," Clara said. "Foreman from the Aldridge spread rode by to tell me." Nathan hung his hat and came to the table and looked at what she had laid out, the certified deed, the second survey, a letter she'd been working on for the past hour. "What are you writing?" "A letter to the territorial court in Cheyenne," Clara said. "Not to the local circuit judge, to the Chief Justice's administrative office." She kept her eyes on the page. "If Pratt has arranged this hearing through local channels, then we go above local channels. We document the chain the debt purchased, the inquiry to Davies, the timing of the hearing filing relative to when that debt was paid off. We lay it out in sequence, and we ask for a stay pending review by the territorial court." Nathan pulled out the chair and sat down beside her, something he'd started doing since the wedding. Beside her, not across from her, a small geography that meant more than it might have looked like from the outside. "A stay takes time," he said. "It takes less time than losing the land," Clara said. She set down her pen and looked at him directly. "Nathan, I need to know everything Pratt has done in the past 4 years. Not just what affected the finances. Everything you know or suspect. Because the debt, the survey dispute, the supply line manipulation, those aren't separate moves. They're the same move repeated. If I can show a pattern, I can show intent, and intent changes what any court does with this." Nathan was quiet for a moment, and Clara recognized the quality of the quiet. It was the one that meant he was deciding how much to say, and had already decided to say all of it, but needed a breath to do it. "There was a man named Carver," Nathan said. "Jack Carver. He had the spread directly south of mine between my land and Pratt's water operation. 3 years ago, Pratt moved on him the same way he moved on me debt supply costs, a legal challenge to his grazing rights. Carver didn't have what I had." "What did you have that he didn't?" "Time," Nathan said. "And Rebecca keeping the books tight enough that when the supply costs started rising, I could see it happening even if I didn't understand it fast enough." He paused. "Carver didn't see it until he was already 6 months behind, and by then Pratt had the bank lined up and the legal claim filed simultaneously. Carver sold in the spring of '82, took 40 cents on the dollar for land worth 3 times that, because it was sell or lose everything at auction. To whom did he sell?" Nathan looked at her. "A land-holding company out of Denver," he said, "called the Western Meridian Trust." "And who owns the Western Meridian Trust?" "That," Nathan said, "is a question 3 people in this territory have tried to answer, and none of them have gotten a clear answer to." Clara picked up her pen and made a note. "We'll get one," she said. She wrote the letter to Cheyenne that night and sent it with the morning stage the next day. Then she did something Nathan didn't know about, until after she wrote a second letter to a man named Gerald Frost in Laramie, a territorial land attorney, whose name she'd found in the margin of one of the older ledger entries in Rebecca's careful hand, annotated with the single word, trustworthy, underlined twice. Gerald Frost arrived in Red Creek on the Thursday following, which was faster than Clara had anticipated, and told her that he'd understood the urgency. He was a compact, precise man of 60, who looked at everything in a room before he looked at any person in it. Windows exits, who was standing where the practiced habit of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where the stakes were high enough that details mattered. He shook Clara's hand first, which was not the usual order of things, and sat down at the kitchen table and read through everything she'd assembled with the concentrated silence of a man to whom every piece of paper tells a story. Nathan sat across from him and said nothing, which was its own form of patience. After 40 minutes, Frost set down the last document and looked up. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "where did you learn to build a case?" "My father's water rights dispute," Clara said. 7 years. I kept his records." "Did he win?" "He did." Frost looked at the papers in front of him. "This is good work. Not complete, but good. The pattern is visible." He tapped a page. "The Western Meridian Trust is the key. If we can connect it to Pratt directly, the picture changes from a property dispute to a conspiracy to defraud, which is a different conversation entirely." "Can we connect it?" Nathan asked. "I have a colleague in Denver who specializes in exactly this kind of corporate registry work," Frost said. It takes time. Not a great deal of time if the connection is there, and he knows what to look for. He paused. But the hearing is in 19 days. How long would the Cheyenne stay application take? Clara asked. If granted promptly, 2 weeks. If the administrative office is backed up, which it frequently is. Frost spread his hands. It could be longer than the hearing date. So we can't rely on the stay, Nathan said. We request it, Frost said, because it costs us nothing to try and might buy us time. But we prepare for the hearing as though the stay will not be granted, which means we need the trust connection in 11 days to have time to prepare the argument. He looked at Nathan. I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Cole. The survey dispute, as Pratt has framed it, is not a strong case on the merits. 2 previous judges dismissed it because the documents don't support his claim. A 3rd judge, however, can choose to see it differently if he's motivated to do so. Our best move is not to defend the survey question. It's to make the survey question irrelevant by making the larger pattern visible. You're saying put Pratt on trial instead of the deed, Clara said. Exactly, Frost said. Make the hearing about whether a man with a documented history of fraudulent interference in land transactions should be permitted to bring a claim in this court at all. That's a different question than whether the 1879 survey was correctly filed, and it's a question that a judge with any integrity cannot easily dismiss. And if the judge has no integrity, Nathan said. Frost picked up his coffee. Then we make enough noise about the attempt that the territorial court in Cheyenne becomes interested on their own without waiting for our application. He took a drink. Courts don't like to be embarrassed in the territorial press, Mr. Cole, even bought ones. Nathan looked at Clara. Clara looked at Nathan. Do it, Nathan said to Frost. Frost went to Denver the next morning. What followed were 11 days that Clara would later describe, when she could describe them calmly, as the most precise and exhausting work she'd ever done in her life, which was saying something, given the competition she had to measure it against. She and Frost's associate, a young, sharp-eyed paralegal he'd sent back from Denver while he worked the registry himself, went through every public record available in Red Creek and the surrounding county. Tax records, property transfers, court filings, business registration documents. Clara had a head for numbers, and the paralegal had a head for legal structure, and together they built the timeline with the meticulous care of people who understood that a chain of argument is only as strong as its weakest link. Nathan was in and out. He managed the ranch by day and sat down with Clara at night, answering questions, filling gaps, providing names and dates she couldn't find in documents because they lived only in the memory of someone who'd been present. Billy Marsh turned out to have an unexpectedly precise recollection of dates and conversations he'd witnessed over his 3 years on the coal spread, and Clara spent 2 evenings taking careful notes of everything Billy could remember about Pratt's men being seen near the property with dates and descriptions. You writing a book, Mrs. Cole? Billy asked on the second evening. A brief, Clara said, but close enough. On the 9th day, Frost's letter arrived from Denver. Clara read it at the kitchen table, while Nathan stood behind her reading over her shoulder, and she felt the moment he understood what the letter contained, felt it in the way he went very still, the particular Nathan Cole stillness that meant something large was landing. The Western Meridian Trust. Frost had found was registered in Colorado under a holding company structure with 3 named directors, none of them Wendell Pratt. But the 4th signatory on the original registration, listed as a silent partner, was a name that appeared elsewhere in Clara's careful documentation, Silas Duncan. The man who had sent for her. The man who had stood her up on the platform in Red Creek, on the day that had changed everything. Clara read the name twice to be certain she was seeing it correctly. Silas Duncan, Nathan said quietly from behind her. Silas Duncan, Clara confirmed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. He was working for Pratt, Nathan said. Or with him. Or Pratt was using him, Clara said, because she was already 3 steps ahead working through it. A mail-order advertisement from a man connected to Pratt in the same town where Pratt was working to take your land. If I'd arrived and married Duncan, you'd have been in his household, Nathan said. In his orbit, connected to Pratt's network. He paused. Or he simply wanted to make sure there wasn't a woman in this house helping me manage things. Clara looked up at him. He was removing a variable, she said slowly. Rebecca kept your books. After she died, you had no one doing that work, and that's when the debt manipulation started and you didn't catch it. Duncan bringing a wife to town and then standing her up, it kept any replacement for that variable from arriving. Or at least it was supposed to. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. He didn't account for you ending up at my ranch anyway. No, Clara said. He didn't. She looked back at Frost's letter. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were completely steady. This changes the argument at the hearing, she said. It's not just a pattern of land fraud. It's a coordinated scheme, and we can now connect two named individuals to it. She set the letter down. I need to write to Frost tonight. Clara. Nathan put his hand on her shoulder just briefly, the way he touched things he was careful with. Are you all right? She considered the question honestly, the way he'd always given her room to. Silas Duncan, the man whose broken promise had put her on Nathan Cole's wagon and changed the entire direction of her life, had done it deliberately, or at least done the connected thing deliberately. His abandonment of her wasn't carelessness or a change of heart. It was a calculated act in a larger scheme. I think, Clara said carefully, that I am angrier than I have ever been in my life, and I think I am going to put that to very productive use. Nathan's hand pressed her shoulder, once brief and certain. Good, he said. The letter went to Frost that night. By the following morning, Clara had revised the entire case argument to incorporate the Duncan connection, restructured the evidence timeline, and drafted the opening statement she intended to deliver personally, a fact she had not yet mentioned to Nathan or to Frost. She mentioned it to Frost when he arrived back from Denver on the 11th day, 2 days before the hearing. Mrs. Cole, Frost said, looking at the statement she'd handed him. This is very good work. However, the convention in these proceedings, the convention, Clara said pleasantly, is that the landowner or his representative addresses the court. I am his wife. I am the one who assembled this case. I am the one who understands every piece of it down to the last entry, and Nathan has agreed. Frost looked at Nathan. She's right on all counts, Nathan said. Frost read the statement again more carefully this time. You'll need to be prepared for a hostile judge, he said. I've been prepared for hostile rooms since I was 12 years old, Clara said. What else? Frost almost smiled. I think, he said, that Wendell Pratt is going to be very surprised. The hearing was held in the Red Creek Courthouse at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning in November, and the room was full in a way that small-town courtrooms fill, when word gets out that something worth watching is happening. Clara recognized faces from the Mercantile, from the street, from the station platform, on the day she'd arrived, the same faces that had whispered and judged and found her wanting. They were not whispering now. They were waiting. Pratt arrived with 2 attorneys and the practiced confidence of a man who had bought what he needed and expected delivery. He looked across the room, found Nathan, and nodded with the contained satisfaction of someone who's been planning a moment and has arrived at it. His eyes moved to Clara and lingered for a moment in a way that was meant to be dismissive, and Clara met his gaze with the same level steadiness she'd brought to every conversation with him since the first day he'd called her merchandise on the main street. Judge Abernathy was a man Clara had not met and had researched as thoroughly as the documents allowed. He was 62, had been on the circuit for 11 years, had never been formally charged with impropriety, though Frost had found 3 cases in the past 2 years where his rulings had benefited Pratt-adjacent parties. He was not a simple villain. He was a man who had made accommodations gradually in the way that gradual accommodations are made until the accommodations had become the shape of his working life. When Pratt's lead attorney finished his opening argument, which was polished, well organized, and made the best possible case for why the 1879 survey was improperly filed and should be superseded by the 1877 original, Abernathy turned to the respondents' table with the slight, barely there impatience of a man who expects the rest of this to be brief. What he found was Clara Cole standing up. Mrs. Cole will be presenting on behalf of the respondent, Frost said from beside her. A murmur went through the room. Abernathy looked at Clara with the particular expression of a man reassessing a situation he thought he'd already assessed. "That is unusual," he said. "Yes, Your Honor," Clara said. "But it is permitted." A beat. "Proceed," Abernathy said. Clara set her notes on the rail in front of her, though she didn't look at them. "Your Honor," she said, "the petitioner would like this court to believe that this hearing is about a boundary survey. It is not. This hearing is about a 4-year campaign by Wendell Pratt to acquire Nathan Cole's land through fraudulent means, and this survey petition is the third instrument of that campaign following the deliberate manipulation of Mr. Cole's supply and credit costs, and the purchase of Mr. Cole's debt under a concealed identity." The murmur in the room got louder. Pratt's attorney was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is not a fraud proceeding. The respondent is establishing context for the petition," Clara said without raising her voice or looking at the attorney, "which the court is permitted to hear." Abernathy looked at her. Something was happening behind his expression that she couldn't fully read, and she'd trained herself not to guess. "Continue," he said. Clara continued. She laid it out in the order she and Frost had built it. The debt purchase through concealed channels, documented by the ledger entries and the bank records Frost had obtained from Cheyenne. The inquiry to the county clerk, documented by Davies's own records and the timing of the filing. The survey petition filed 9 days after the debt was paid in full, which she paused on. Deliberately, let the courtroom hear the silence of that timing. Let the arithmetic of it sit in the air for a moment before she moved on. And then she put the Western Meridian Trust on the table. She laid out the property transfer documentation for the Carver land, the trust registration, the silent partner signature, and the connection to Silas Duncan, whose advertisement for a mail-order bride in a Missouri newspaper had appeared. She noted precisely 11 days after Rebecca Cole's death. The room went very quiet. Pratt was no longer relaxed in his chair. His attorney was writing rapidly on a notepad, and the second attorney had leaned over and was speaking in a low, urgent voice that Pratt was not responding to. "The petitioner argues," Clara said, "that a survey filed 11 years ago was improperly processed. The respondent argues that this court is being used as an instrument of a scheme that has in its 4-year operation cost one family their land at fraudulent prices, contributed to circumstances that affected the health and survival of another family member, and attempted to subvert the legitimate records of this county's own clerk." She looked at Abernathy directly. "We are requesting that this petition be dismissed with prejudice, and that the full record of this proceeding be transmitted to the territorial court in Cheyenne for review." The attorney was on his feet again loudly this time. Abernathy held up one hand, and the attorney stopped. The judge looked at the documents Clara had submitted. He looked at them for a long time. The room was so quiet that Clara could hear the man behind her breathing. She did not look at Nathan, though she was aware of him, the way she was always aware of him now, a steady, solid presence at her back. "Mr. Hargreave," Abernathy said to Pratt's lead attorney, "Your Honor, I am going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Are you aware of the Western Meridian Trust documentation the respondent has submitted?" A pause. The kind of pause that is its own answer. "I am not personally familiar with." "I see," Abernathy said. He looked at Pratt then directly, and something passed between them that Clara could feel from across the room, the end of an arrangement, quiet as a door closing. Abernathy looked back at Clara. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "how long did it take you to assemble this?" 11 days, Your Honor, with help. 11 days. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to recess this hearing for 2 weeks pending review of the submitted documentation." He looked at Pratt's table. "At which time the petitioner will be expected to address the respondent's evidence directly. This court will not be ruling on the survey question until the broader context has been examined." He gathered the papers in front of him. "And I will be transmitting a copy of the full record to Cheyenne myself." He stood. The room stood. And Wendell Pratt, for the first time in the 4 years Nathan Cole had been fighting him, had nothing to say. Clara sat down. Under the table, Nathan's hand found hers and held it, and she held it back, and neither of them said a word. Billy Marsh in the second row looked at the ceiling in the particular way young men look at ceilings when they are trying not to let anyone see that they are moved. Mrs. Tanner, standing near the back wall, permitted herself a small firm nod. The recess became 3 weeks rather than 2 because the territorial court's response arrived faster than expected. The stay Clara had applied for was granted, which meant the survey hearing was now in the hands of a Cheyenne judge rather than a local one, which meant it was for all practical purposes out of Pratt's reach. The fraud investigation was another matter, and it moved slowly. The way territorial investigations move deliberately with the particular bureaucratic patience of institutions that understood they were building something that had to hold. But the land was safe. That much was clear within days of the recess, and Clara felt the certainty of it settle into her bones like warmth after a long cold. She came home from town the day the stay confirmation arrived, and found Nathan in the barn with Comet running a brush along the horse's flank in the unhurried way he had with animals, the same way he had with most things he cared about, patient and consistent and without performance. She leaned against the stall doorway and told him. He kept brushing for a moment after she'd finished, and then he stopped and turned and looked at her, and his expression was not triumph, not relief, not even happiness exactly. It was something quieter than all of those, something that went deeper. "It's done," he said. "The investigation's still ongoing. Pratt isn't." "I know," Nathan said, "but the land's safe." "Yes," Clara said. "The land's safe." He set down the brush and crossed the stall and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him. This man who'd pulled her suitcase off a platform in a town that wanted nothing to do with her, and offered her a locked door and a fair wage, and turned out to be carrying a grief so large it had hollowed out every room in his house. "I have been fighting that man for 4 years," Nathan said, "and I have been fighting him alone for 2, and I have been losing ground the whole time without knowing it." He paused. "You walked into this 6 weeks ago and changed the whole direction of it." "You gave me somewhere to stand," Clara said. "I used it." "Clara." He said her name the way he'd started saying it, without the formality, without the distance, as simply and directly as he said the name of anything he trusted. "I told you the day I asked you to marry me that I couldn't promise romance, that I'd be difficult and stubborn and quiet." "You have been all 3, Clara agreed. "I'm not going to promise I'll stop being any of them," he said. "I know," she said, "but I need you to know something." He looked at her steadily, and there was nothing guarded in his expression. No door half closed, no careful rationing of what he let show. "I did not ask you to marry me only for the legal protection of it. I asked you because somewhere in the middle of ledger books and supply lists and cattle prices, I stopped being able to imagine this house without you in it." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Nathan Cole," she said, "that is the most honest thing anyone has said to me since I was a girl watching my mother fix my dress before church." Something moved across his face, that rare real thing that was not quite a smile and was better than one. "Well," he said, "I told you I was difficult. Didn't promise I was poetic." Clara laughed, and it came out clean and full and real, the kind of laugh she hadn't heard come out of herself in longer than she could precisely remember, and Nathan looked at her laughing the way a man looks at something he'd forgotten. He missed the warmth of it, the sound of it in a house that had been quiet too long. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face gently, the same way he did everything he meant, and she felt the careful certainty of his hand and understood that this was what he looked like when he wasn't protecting anything anymore. "Reckon we're going to be all right," Nathan said. "We are," Clara said. "We already are." Outside, Billy Marsh was doing something extremely noisy and unnecessary with the water trough, which was his way of ensuring that anyone in the barn knew he was very much not listening, and Clara suspected he'd been doing it for the past 5 minutes. "Billy," Nathan said, raising his voice slightly toward the barn door. "Sir." Billy's voice came back innocence itself. "Go home. It's past supper." "Yes, sir," Billy said, and they could hear him trying very hard not to run. Clara looked at her husband in the quiet of the barn, with the horses breathing around them, and the evening settling down over the land they'd fought to keep, and felt something she hadn't felt since Missouri. Not happiness exactly, not yet, or not only that, but something more fundamental than happiness. She felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because the world had arranged it neatly, because it hadn't. It had been arranged by grief and fraud, and a man who'd stood her up on a train platform, and a cowboy who'd picked up her suitcase because he couldn't stand the sight of a woman being kicked while she was down. But sometimes the disarranged thing lands somewhere better than the arranged thing would have. And sometimes the person who offers you a locked door and a fair wage turns out to be the person who changes everything. The investigation moved the way justice moved in the Wyoming Territory, slowly, then all at once. For the first 6 weeks after the hearing recess, nothing appeared to change. Pratt still walked the main street of Red Creek with his gold watch chain and his polished boots, and the practiced ease of a man who had not yet accepted that the ground had shifted under him. His attorneys were still filing motions in Cheyenne, still generating paperwork, still doing the procedural work of men who'd been paid to delay what they couldn't prevent. The fraud investigation was open, but not public, and territorial investigators had the particular discretion of people who understood that moving too fast on a man like Pratt would let him see the trap closing and run before it did. Clara knew all of this because Gerald Frost wrote to her every week, and because she'd learned to read the shape of a legal proceeding the way her mother had learned to read weather, not from any single sign, but from the accumulation of small ones. Nathan knew it because Clara told him, and because he trusted her reading of it. That trust, the easy, unguarded quality of it, was the thing that had changed most visibly between them in the weeks since the hearing. Not that they'd been distrustful before, but there had always been a carefulness to it, the careful way of people who've been hurt and are moving deliberately so as not to be hurt the same way again. The carefulness was still there, because it was in both their natures and probably always would be. But underneath it now was something solid, something that didn't require tending every day to stay alive. Billy noticed because Billy noticed everything about other people's feelings, while remaining magnificently oblivious to his own. "You two are different," he told Clara one morning when he was supposed to be hauling feed and had instead stationed himself in the kitchen doorway for no apparent purpose. "Different from what?" Clara said without looking up from the account book. "From how you were before, when you first got here." Billy thought about this. "It's like before you were both being real polite to each other. Like when strangers share a coach and they're trying to take up as little space as possible." Clara looked up at that. "And now," she said. "Now you take up space," Billy said, and seemed to feel this was self-explanatory and went to get the feed. Clara sat with that for a moment and decided he was right, and found it was the best description of a marriage she'd ever heard. The first real crack in Pratt's composure appeared on a Tuesday in December when the territorial court in Cheyenne issued a formal notice requiring him to respond to a fraud complaint within 30 days. It was not an indictment, not yet, but it was the court acknowledging officially and on the record that the complaint had sufficient merit to require a response. Frost sent the notice to Clara by express courier with a single line of his own at the bottom. "The dam is holding water. Give it time." Nathan read the notice at the kitchen table that evening. He read it twice carefully, the way he read anything he needed to be sure about. 30 days for him to respond, he said. "And whatever he submits in response goes into the record," Clara said. "Which means whatever he says to defend himself is now evidence we can use in the next stage." Nathan set the notice down and looked at her across the table. "You enjoy this, don't you? The legal reasoning." "I enjoy problems that can be solved with the right documents in the right order," Clara said. "My father called it the most useful kind of stubbornness there is." "Your father was a smart man." "He was," Clara said. "He would have liked you." Nathan was quiet for a moment, and she watched him receive the small particular warmth of it, a woman's family, approving of you from across the distance of death, which was a more complicated comfort than it might have looked. "Tell me something about him," Nathan said. "Not for any reason, just tell me." Clara set down her pen. She told Nathan about her father, William Whitfield, who'd been a farmer and a stubborn one who'd believed that a piece of land was the most honest thing a man could own because it didn't lie. It was either productive or it wasn't. And you knew exactly what you were dealing with every single day. Who'd spent 7 years fighting his neighbor over water rights, not because he was bellicose by nature, but because he believed in the principle that what was legally yours was yours, and no amount of pressure or inconvenience should make you hand it to someone who'd taken it dishonestly. Who'd read to his daughters every Sunday evening from whatever book he could get his hands on because he believed educated women were harder to take advantage of, and the world needed fewer women who could be taken advantage of. Who had died of a grief that looked exactly like giving up 6 months after Clara's mother, because he had built his whole life around a woman, and when she was gone, the architecture of everything he'd made collapsed from the inside. Nathan listened to all of it, the way he listened to everything she said, completely without interruption, without the mild impatience that some men showed when women told them things they hadn't specifically asked for. "He sounds like a man I'd have been glad to know," Nathan said when she'd finished. "He was," Clara said. And then, because it was true and she was done not saying true things, "I think he would have recognized something in you. The same solidity. The same sense that a person should be what they say they are and do what they say they'll do." Nathan looked at her steadily. "I'm not always what I'd want to be. Neither was he," Clara said. "That's not the point. The point is that you keep trying to be even when it's difficult. That was the thing about my father. He kept trying." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "I haven't talked about Rebecca in a while," he said. It wasn't a pivot away from what she'd said. She understood that. It was the same conversation continued. "You can," Clara said. "I know." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "That's what's different now. I know I can." He looked up at her. "For a long time, I thought talking about her was the same thing as staying stuck in it. Like if I said her name too much, I was keeping myself from—" He stopped. "But it's the opposite, isn't it? You said it yourself. Keeping the dead alive in words isn't the same as refusing to move." "No," Clara said. "It isn't." "She'd have liked this," Nathan said. He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the tablecloth, the straightened curtains, the shelf of books that had grown from Clara's original few to a small but deliberate collection. "She always wanted the house to look like someone chose it. I never knew quite how to do that without her." "You knew how to keep it ready," Clara said. "That was its own kind of faith." Nathan looked at her and Clara saw it happen, saw the last door open, the one that had still been slightly not quite consciously closed, and something in him ease into a new configuration, the way a joint settles when the pressure's been on it too long. "Clara," he said. Thank you." She didn't ask for what. She understood it covered the entire territory of the past 4 months, and she simply nodded and picked up her pen, and they sat together in the warm kitchen of the home they'd built out of wreckage and stubbornness and a locked door, and the evening closed around them, and it was enough. Pratt's response to the territorial court arrived at the end of the 30 days, and it was, as Frost wrote to Clara immediately after reading it, the response of a man who has run out of better options and is now simply hoping the wall holds. It didn't hold. The response attempted to reframe the Western Meridian Trust connection as an unrelated business association, to characterize the debt purchase as a legitimate financial transaction with no fraudulent intent, and to dismiss the survey filing as an independent legal action with no relation to the other matters. It was well written as far as it went. But it contained one critical error in attempting to distance Pratt from the trust. His attorneys had submitted an affidavit from Silas Duncan attesting that Pratt had no operational involvement in the trust's land acquisitions. What the affidavit did not know, because Pratt apparently had not told his attorneys, was that Clara and Frost already had a letter obtained from the Denver Registry during Frost's initial research, in which Pratt had written to the trust's registered agent about the Carver land acquisition in language that made his involvement not merely operational, but directive. The letter had been sitting in Frost's file for 6 weeks waiting, When Clara read Frost's account of the affidavit, she set the letter down on the table and pressed both hands flat on the surface and breathed in the way she breathed when something very large was landing. "He walked into it," she said. Nathan was beside her. He read the relevant passage from Frost's letter twice. "A false affidavit in a territorial court proceeding," he said. "Submitted under oath," Clara confirmed, "which is not a property dispute anymore." Nathan sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, and Clara watched him absorb the full weight of what she was saying, that Pratt, in trying to protect himself from the fraud investigation, had just handed the territorial court something considerably more serious than fraud to investigate. "Frost needs the letter tonight," Clara said. "Send it," Nathan said. She sent it. What followed happened faster than anything in the territorial legal system had a right to happen, which told Clara that people in Cheyenne had been waiting for exactly this kind of definitive document, the way you wait for rain after a long dry stretch. Within 2 weeks, the fraud investigation was upgraded. Within 3, a territorial marshal arrived in Red Creek, not from the local office but from Cheyenne directly, which was its own statement, and spent 4 days interviewing witnesses and collecting documents and visiting notably the county commissioner, who'd been seen at Pratt's house twice in October. Pratt remained in Red Creek through all of it, which Clara found she respected in a grim, limited way. He didn't run. She'd half expected him to, and he didn't. He walked the main street with his watch chain and his polished boots, and received the marshal's questions through his attorneys, and maintained to the end the posture of a man who had done nothing that other men in his position hadn't done before him, which was, Clara supposed, the truest thing about him. He wasn't wrong exactly. Men in his position had done exactly what he'd done, and worse, and gotten away with it, because no one had built a complete enough record to stop them. The difference this time was 11 days of work at a kitchen table and a woman who'd been keeping her father's accounts since she was 14 years old. Pratt was formally charged on a Thursday morning in February, 6 months after Clara Whitfield had stepped off a train in Red Creek, Wyoming with a suitcase and $19 and a letter from a man who never came. Clara was in town that day at the dry goods store when word came through the street. She was discussing the spring supply order with Mrs. Tanner when the door opened and Billy came in with the particular look on his face that he'd been carrying since October. The look of a young man who had been present at something significant and was not entirely sure how to contain the size of it. "They've taken him," Billy said. Mrs. Tanner set down her measuring tape and looked at Clara. Clara set down the order list and looked at Billy. "He went quiet," Billy said. I don't know what I thought. I thought he'd make a scene, but he just went quiet. And he got into the marshal's wagon and he looked straight ahead and he didn't look at anybody." He paused. "He looked real small, Mrs. Cole." Clara thought about that. "Yes," she said, "he would." She thanked Mrs. Tanner, took her order, and drove the 6 miles back to the ranch in the particular clear, cold air of a Wyoming February, and found Nathan at the fence line with the new post he'd been installing all morning because Nathan Cole kept working through everything and always would. She pulled the wagon to a stop and called to him, and he came across the field with the unhurried stride of a man who'd learned not to run toward things until he knew what he was running toward. "They charged him," Clara said. Nathan stood at the wagon side and looked up at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. She watched him absorb it, not with triumph, because Nathan Cole was not a man built for triumph, but with the particular settled release of a man who has been holding a thing a long time and has finally been permitted to put it down. "Rebecca would have wanted to know the moment it happened," he said. Clara looked at him. "Tell her," she said simply. Nathan turned and looked out across the land. The east parcel where Pratt's man had stood measuring with his transit and his string, the creek line that would keep flowing where it had always flowed, the fence line that would stay where Nathan had set it. He was quiet for a moment, just a man standing on his own land, talking to someone who wasn't there in the particular private way of people who refused to entirely give up the conversation. Clara looked away and gave him that, and the cold air was very still around them. When he turned back, his face was clear. "Come in," he said. "It's too cold to be out." "You've been out all morning," Clara pointed out. "I've got more layers than you," he said, which was Nathan Cole's version of being protective without saying so. And Clara had learned to accept it in the spirit in which it was meant. Spring came, the way Wyoming springs came, arguing with winter the whole way. A warm week, followed by a cold snap, followed by 3 days of rain that was half ice, until suddenly one morning the air simply was different, and you could feel it in your chest before you had any conscious thought about it. Clara planted the kitchen garden in April. She'd been planning it since February, sketching it in the margins of the supply lists, working out what would grow in the particular combination of light and soil beside the ranch house, and she did it with the focused pleasure of someone who has been handed a piece of ground and told it's theirs to make something of. Nathan watched her work for 3 mornings before he came and crouched beside her in the dirt and said, "What do you need?" "More posts for the bean rows," Clara said without looking up. "And if you could level that corner, the ground dips there and the water won't drain right." He leveled the corner. He brought the posts. He built the trellises she sketched on the back of a supply list without being asked twice about anything. "You're good at this," Clara said one evening, looking at the trellises he'd built precise, and even the wood fitted with the same careful competence he brought to everything. "I'm good at building things," Nathan said. "You're good at knowing what to build." Clara considered that division of labor and found it exactly right. The Carver family came back in May. This was the part Clara hadn't expected, hadn't thought to hope for, because she'd been too focused on what could be saved to think clearly about what might be recovered. Jack Carver was a lean, weathered man of 45 who arrived at the ranch with his wife and 2 sons on a Saturday morning and stood at the kitchen door with his hat in both hands in a way that reminded Clara powerfully of Billy's nervousness and was entirely different in kind. This was the weight of a man who'd swallowed a hard thing for 3 years and was now being asked to look at it again. As part of the fraud proceedings, the territorial court had ruled that the Carver land sale conducted under the fraudulent pressure Pratt had applied was voidable, the Western Meridian Trust. Its assets now frozen pending the fraud case could not block the return of the property. If the Carvers could make a payment arrangement with the court-appointed receiver, they could buy back what had been taken from them. Nathan had known this was coming. He had, without telling Clara until the morning of, written a personal letter to the receiver's office in January, offering to guarantee the Carver family's payment arrangement against his own land if necessary. Clara had found the copy of the letter by accident in March, in the desk drawer where Nathan filed correspondence. She'd read it twice, set it back in the drawer, closed the drawer, stood in the kitchen for a long moment by herself. When Nathan came into that evening, she looked at him across the kitchen and said, "You guaranteed the Carver land." Nathan set his hat on the hook. "I did." "Against our property." "Against my property, technically, since I did it before we were—" He stopped because the look on her face told him the distinction was not one she was accepting. "Against our property," he amended. "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "I didn't tell you because I knew you'd want to do it too, and one of us needed to have some sleep." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Next time," she said, "you tell me, and we decide together." "Yes, ma'am," Nathan said, which was not a concession, but a genuine acknowledgement, and she heard the difference. Now, Jack Carver stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, and Nathan stood across from him, and the 2 men looked at each other across 3 years of distance, and the particular complicated fellowship of men who have both been worked over by the same opponent. "I hear you went to bat for us with the receiver," Carver said. "I did," Nathan said. "Don't know that I'd have done the same were it the other way." "You might have," Nathan said. "Hard to know what you'll do until the moment's there." Carver's jaw worked. "I should have fought harder when he came at me. You held on. I sold." "You did what you could with what you had," Nathan said. "That's all any man does." It wasn't absolution. Nathan Cole was not built for, performed absolution, but it was something plainer and more honest than absolution, and Carver's shoulders came down half an inch, and the 2 men shook hands with the grip of people acknowledging something that didn't need to be said in full to be understood. Clara gave the Carver family coffee and food and sent Nathan's account books home with them, the ones that contained everything she'd documented about Pratt's supply manipulation. because the Carver family's attorneys would need exactly that evidence in their own parallel civil claim, and sharing it cost nothing. Mrs. Carver gripped Clara's hand at the door when they left. "You're the one who put it together," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "We all put it together," Clara said. "It took all of us." "My girls are 9 and 11, Mrs. Carver said. "I want them to grow up knowing a woman did this." Clara looked at her. "Tell them the whole story," Clara said. "The parts where it was hard too. That's the part worth knowing." Mrs. Carver nodded and took her family home to land that was theirs again, and Clara stood on the porch and watched them go and felt the spring air on her face, and understood that this specifically was what her father had meant when he said that a piece of land was the most honest thing you could fight for, because what you built on it was real, and when you fought for it, you were fighting for something real, and that mattered in a way that outlasted the fight itself. The fraud trial in Cheyenne was set for September, 7 months away, and Clara and Frost spent the summer building the case with the methodical patience of people who understood they were doing something that needed to be done correctly rather than fast. It occupied her mornings mostly, the evenings were the ranches and Nathan's, and the slow accumulating life of two people who had stopped being careful with each other in the guarded way, and had started being careful with each other in the way you're careful with things you value. Nathan started talking about Rebecca more naturally, not every day, not with the effortful quality of someone working through grief on a schedule, but the way you mention a person who is important to you and still is present tense, because importance doesn't have a past tense. He'd tell Clara something Rebecca had planted in the garden, and Clara would take note of it, and sometimes plant the same thing, and sometimes ask why Rebecca had liked it, and Nathan would tell her, and she would add it to the interior record she kept of the woman who had kept this man's accounts in a neat, careful hand and made every room feel like it had been waiting for her. Clara told Nathan about Emily, told him more than she'd told him on the wedding night, the fuller version. The one that included Emily's laugh and her habit of naming every stray animal that came within 50 feet of the Whitfield property, and her absolute, unshakable conviction that things would work out right up until they didn't. "She sounds like someone who made a room lighter just by being in it," Nathan said. "She did," Clara said. "I'd forgotten that. I'd been so focused on missing her that I'd stopped being able to picture what it actually felt like when she was there." And now, Clara thought about it. "Now I can picture it again," she said. "I don't know when that changed." Nathan looked at her. "I think it changed when you stopped being alone with it," he said. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I think that's exactly right." The trial came in September, and Pratt was convicted on 3 of the 5 charges: fraud in the acquisition of the Carver land, fraudulent concealment of financial interest in the survey proceeding, and subornation of perjury through the false affidavit. The 2 charges relating to the debt manipulation were reduced to civil penalties rather than criminal ones, which was the compromise that territorial courts made when they were trying to thread a needle between what was provable and what was just. Clara read the verdict letter from Frost in the kitchen, Nathan beside her, the way he always was now, and she went through each count carefully, and when she reached the end, she set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. "Is it enough?" Nathan asked. "It's never entirely enough," Clara said. "Rebecca is still gone. 3 years of Carver land are still lost no matter that they got it back. And men like Pratt." She stopped. "There will be men like Pratt. There will always be men like Pratt." "I know," Nathan said. "But he won't be operating in this territory again. The civil penalties will take everything he has liquid, and the criminal conviction means no court in Wyoming will hear his name on a land claim without looking twice at it." Clara looked at the letter. "And every piece of it is on the record. Everything we built. Everything we documented. It stays in the court record, which means the next man who tries this particular sequence of moves in Wyoming territory is going to find that someone's already mapped it." Nathan put his hand over hers on the table. "Your father would have been proud," he said. Clara felt it land, felt it all the way through, the particular warmth of that a man knowing exactly the right thing to say and saying it plainly. "He would have been insufferable about it," Clara said. He would have told the story at every supper for the next 20 years and made it progressively more dramatic with each telling. "I'd have liked to hear that," Nathan said. "So would I," Clara said, and meant it simply and without weight, the way she'd learned to mean things that hurt and were also true. The evening after the verdict letter came, Nathan built a fire in the sitting room, the first time he'd used the fireplace. Since Clara had lived there, she realized which meant the first time since Rebecca, which meant something she didn't say out loud, because she understood it was something he was doing on purpose and it deserved to be done without commentary. They sat beside it, and the fire was warm, and outside, the Wyoming night was clear and cold and full of stars, and the ranch was quiet around them in the way it was quiet when everything that needed to be done was done, and tomorrow was its own concern. "I want to tell you something," Nathan said. Clara waited. "The day you stepped off that train." He paused, arranging the words with the same care he brought to everything he meant. "I wasn't trying to be a decent man. I want you to know that. I wasn't performing some virtue. I was just—" He stopped again. "I was angry. I watched this town line up to make you smaller than your situation had already made you, and I was angry about it, and offering you a job was the only action I could think of to put against the anger." "I know," Clara said. "I'm telling you because I don't want you to think it was noble. I'm not a noble man." "Nathan," Clara said, "you guaranteed a stranger's land against your own because someone had wronged them and you had the means to help. That's not noble. That's just good." He looked at her. "You're the best person I know," Clara said, and meant it with a directness that she'd stopped being afraid of sometime in the spring. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I thought I was giving you a place to stay," he said. His voice was low and even, and she heard everything in it: 2 years of silence and grief and fighting alone, and the particular loneliness of a man who'd built something worth having and had no one to build it with. "The day I put you in my wagon and drove you out here, I thought I was solving a practical problem." "And," Clara said, "and you were the one who gave me a reason to come home," he said. "Not the ranch, not the land. You." Clara looked at the fire for a moment and felt the full weight of those words settle into her chest and stay there, not painfully, not with the grief weight she'd grown accustomed to things carrying, but with the solid, permanent quality of something true that had found the place it belonged. "I came to Wyoming with $19 and a letter from a man who didn't want me," she said. "I came because I had nothing left, and I thought nothing might be better elsewhere." She turned and looked at him. "And somewhere between the ledger books and the county clerk's office and a wedding supper with 4 people and a cake that wasn't left over from anything, I stopped being a woman who had lost everything." "What are you now?" Nathan asked, and she heard that he was asking genuinely, asking her to name it for both of them. Clara looked at her husband, this steady, difficult, honest man who'd pulled her suitcase off a platform and changed the entire course of her life by doing so. Who'd told her she could ask anything and meant it? Who said, "Tell me their names in a kitchen on a wedding night," and made room for her grief? The way he made room for everything. He valued carefully and completely and without performance. "I'm home," Clara said. "That's what I am." Nathan Cole looked at the woman he had married for practical reasons that had become the truest thing in his life and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be added to that. They sat beside the fire, and the night settled around the ranch that had been fought for and kept on land that had been held by stubbornness and ledger books and a woman who'd arrived as a stranger and stayed as something irreplaceable, and the past was present with them. William and Margaret and Emily, Rebecca, Ann Cole. Not as grief, not as absence, but as the people who had made them who they were and who lived on in the specific, real way that people live on when someone refuses to stop saying their names. Clara Whitfield had arrived in Red Creek, Wyoming, with nothing but a suitcase and a broken promise, and she had built a life out of the wreckage with her own 2 hands, and the help of a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer another person isn't love. Not yet, but simply this: a locked door, a fair wage, and the willingness to ask when someone is crying over everything they've lost, Tell me their names." That was how it began. And everything it became after was because neither of them ever stopped answering.